I'm going to ask Andy Lloyd to come up and take us through our first presentation. I've asked Andy to just give us a little stock take, if you like, about what use is made of examinations across the university at present and explore via that some of the reasons why we might use them.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thanks very much for the invite. As Neil's just kind of mentioned, if you like, he asked me to come along and say a few things about what do we know about exams as a form of assessment. And I think it's fair to say that Neil did acknowledge that is open to fairly wide interpretation, as we know a significant amount, but equally I would say there are a number of areas that we don't know an awful lot about. He asked me to look at some of the benefits around examinations. No judgments here. All I want to do really is present a little bit of data and some ideas that I hope will help stimulate your thinking in this area. So what I want to do then is look first then at the number and spread of exams across the university, and I've got some data that we collected from the assessment audit, and if anybody was involved in that, just to reiterate the thanks to all of you for all of the work that was undertaken on what was quite considerable, quite a huge task really, to try and get a baseline in terms of what we are doing around assessment. Something about exams, and I'm not seeking to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that's a really important point here around exams, because we do make significant use of them, and they are an important method of assessment. Some of the ways in which we believe students are currently getting feedback on exams, and some of the issues that I think have arisen around that you may be able to comment and update that to some degree. And finally, again, some of the outcomes from the audit in terms of what we were asked to do in terms of analysis, looking at the relationship between exams and student satisfaction. As I mentioned, I'm not commenting on current practices, I'm not seeking to make judgments on those, but there may be some conclusions that do kind of emerge that you may feel you want to look at further. Okay, so looking college by college, and looking first at PSE in terms of the number and proportion of exams that are undertaken as a method of assessment. What you can see there, I think, is that there's some variation between schools. Roughly around about a third of assessments within that college are exams, but there are in some schools, and probably for good reason, a significant number of exams that are used. I think what is interesting about this college as well is looking at PGT compared to undergraduate, in that there isn't really a significant difference between the number of exams that are offered in taught postgraduate programs as opposed to undergraduate. It is quite clearly an important, fairly fundamental method of assessment that is used quite widely across that college. Looking then at biomedical and life sciences, and I should point out a caveat, an immediate caveat here, that this data is for modular programs only. So in terms of the MBBCH in the School of Medicine and the BDS in the School of Dentistry, they are excluded from this sample because they are not modular. So in terms of the work that we did looking at credit size, etc., we weren't able to make comparisons between them. But you can immediately see that while again there is some variation between schools, there's a similar proportion of exams within undergraduate programs. Should also point out as well that for the purpose of this data we have combined exams and class tests. Class tests is a little bit of a misnomer, and I think that there are various methods of assessment that are used or that are ran under that label. Class tests really being the time-constrained assessments that are run outside the examination period. And I think that label itself probably was an administrative convenience some time ago, and I think it is something that we need to look at. But certainly in optometry and in healthcare and in pharmacy, the number of class tests that are done off very often for specific competencies. So they're done for very good professional reasons, but in terms of this data, they are included as an exam in terms of that time-constrained type assessment. Just a word about PGT here, and a caution again, perhaps again in terms of the PGT data in that, well, people talk about PGT as one thing, it probably isn't, because there is a huge number of different programs that are operated across the university. Some of them around CPD, very professional, some much more academic, and the student numbers within those PGT programs are quite significantly different. Hence, I think a little bit of a word of caution in terms of that data. But again, in terms of PGT, healthcare and medic use a lot of time-constrained assessments for professional competencies. But there is, in this college, a reduction in terms of the number of exams that are run within PGT programs compared to the undergraduate programs. And that is a pattern that is even more marked in the data from arts, humanities and social studies, where again, undergraduates typically around about a third of the methods of assessment across the piece. But in PGT, with the exception of the business school, there are very few that actually make double figures in terms of percentage of exams that are held in taught postgraduate programs. But also I found interesting, and it's not on this slide, is that I almost expected the number of exams probably to reduce over time as a student went through an undergraduate program. But in both BLS and in AHSS, actually more exams were held at level 6 than was the case at level 4, thinking that often in level 4 it might be a good way of managing large student numbers rather than perhaps a more appropriate method of assessment at those more advanced levels. So bringing that together, and just to kind of summarise, I think the first thing that stuck out from this analysis, because I've looked at this data over a number of years, or looked at certainly the proportion of exams over a number of years, is it hasn't really significantly changed in the last 10 years. The phrase I often use when thinking about assessment changes is glacial. It is not an area of academic practice that responds very quickly to changes, and we certainly appear to be offering a very similar assessment diet than perhaps we have done over some years. It does vary both between schools and individual colleges and between colleges. But as I mentioned, there are more exams at the higher levels in the undergraduate programs in AHSS and in PSE, and there are significantly less exams in PGT provision in both AHSS and BLS. Now, in terms of when those exams are held, and I think this is quite important and is something that I'm sure will emerge later, that roughly 1/3 of them are held at the end of the autumn semester, often in that January period, 2/3 in the period now. I'm sure you're all very conscious of the marking workload that comes out of the exams that are being run currently. There has also, though, I think been a very significant increase in requests for specific provision in the last 10 years. And I think that is something that, again, is impacting on both the exams that we run, but is a question perhaps in terms of the nature of assessment that we typically run. And while there are class tests, they are concentrated in a small number of schools. There are a lot of schools that don't have anything around a class test. They have a lot of coursework, they have some exams at the end of a semester, and it is, as I mentioned before, much more typically those professional schools that have class tests as a way in which a student can demonstrate their attainment of a specific competence. What I was asked then was to say a little bit about the kind of the educational basis on the reason that we do exams, and there isn't a huge amount of research out there. I did spend some time trying to identify what research there was in terms of the effectiveness of exams as an educational research method. And rather than saying exams are good or exams are bad, I'm not going to say that, and I wouldn't want to say that anyway. What I think I did manage to identify were a number of issues that I think we do need to consider, and I'm sure you do consider in terms of running exams. So these areas to consider, one of which is very much around the pedagogy and the practicalities. And sometimes there is a little bit of a relationship between these, because we're dealing with very large student numbers, and I think the suspicion always has been that exams are a quite convenient way of managing assessment. You may not say now, like that now, when you've got all the marking in front of you, but as a way of turning around a large number of students who are undertaking assessments. There are some practicalities and benefits that can be gained from that. While there are very different discipline-specific needs and requirements, particularly in some of those professional courses, I think it's important to try and have a look at the pedagogy here in terms of what the exams are doing. Because yes, exams I think can provide an opportunity for students to look at different sources of evidence, analyse those sources of evidence and make a choice. They can be very useful as a time-constrained method through which students can demonstrate a lot of knowledge and make decisions fairly quickly. I do worry a little bit about exams in terms of how much they are around critical analysis, some of the more advanced skills that we are looking to develop in our students, and whether they are actually sometimes a little bit of a test of memory. And there is a lot of cramming, as Neil alluded to earlier, that typically does take place. But I think it's a question just of thinking about what it is you're trying to do within those exams, because they do have a significant influence and impact on student behaviour. We know that students are driven by assessment. The famous quote from Bowd is that students can escape bad teaching, but they cannot escape bad assessment. It does have an impact on the way in which students undertake their learning, and it can, I fear, have something of a backwash in that regard, in that students are very much learning as a way of passing the test, rather than learning for learning's sake and looking to extend and become more imaginative in the way that they approach this task. So I think we need to look at the alignment between the learning outcomes, the teaching and assessment. And I worry sometimes that we say a lot of things in our learning outcomes that will be then assessed by an exam. It's actually quite difficult to demonstrate how a student can meet those learning outcomes. As a consequence of that, that has that impact on student behaviour, where they are very much focusing their learning on the exam task rather than on the learning that we would hope they achieve within a different module. I think we also need to be careful of overusing exams in terms of the outcomes achieved by different student groups. And there's a lot of research in this area. Some of it's a little inconclusive, and I'm not suggesting this otherwise. But certainly in terms of gender, in terms of background, ethnic group, and no doubt some of the other professional protected characteristics, there is some evidence that students from different groups do better or worse in exams. And I think that's why, more than anything else, we need to look at exams as one, but only one, of a wider and more balanced diet of assessment for our students. But you might say, yes, but they can't plagiarise. They can't buy an essay in. And I don't know how many of you listened to the Radio 4 documentary that I know Neil posted on the assessment and feedback community on Yammer. If you haven't, I would recommend you do. It's a fascinating listen. It's really interesting. It is about the kind of essay mills and students buying essays, and these essays being written to order. And apart from the fact that students very rarely get the quality of essay they believe that they do when they buy an essay, and apart from the fact that it is a really growing business, it is a worrying area, and it's certainly something that tools such as Turnitin obviously can't pick up. But having said all that, we had last session over 80 students that were found committing unfair practice in the exam day. And I don't know whether any of you have read some of the other things that have been in the media recently about this area, but there are some increasingly sophisticated and quite challenging methods of cheating that students have chosen to adopt. There has been invisible ink. There was a student in the States who was found trying to break into his campus as a way of trying to steal the examination in advance. If only they spent as much time on their learning as they did on imaginative ways in which they can try and gain an advantage in exams. But the point of highlighting the number of cases of unfair practice in exams is to maybe point out that they're not unique, they're not divorced from unfair practice, and that there are a number of cases of unfair practice within exams. And okay, we caught 80. or the invigilators in the exam score change, but how many more may have taken up examples or ways in which they can seek to gain an unfair advantage in that method of assessment. Again, I think this points to the need to have that more balanced diet of assessment methods and to look particularly at coursework of assessment methods that can help minimise the risk of plagiarism. So what do we say as a university? Now, I'm very, very loath whenever I come along to anything like this to say this is university policy, but this is university policy. This is what the university has said about feedback on exams, and there is some flexibility within that, and I think there is good reason for some of that flexibility in that, particularly around those professional disciplines that find it very difficult to write questions, are very worried about the impact of those questions then being posted on social media for future groups. But the key facts are that students should get some feedback on exam performance, and they should be informed as to how they're getting it. And I think one of the key issues, and I'll highlight this again a little bit later on, is how we manage student expectations in this area. Because I'm not sure that we are doing as good a job as we might be able to do in that respect. This flexibility is also not an excuse to do the minimum. I mentioned there are some genuine differences, particularly in some of the healthcare areas where it's very difficult to write very complex questions, and there is a real risk of those going on social media, and then having to spend an awful lot of time trying to write good questions again. But the one thing that the university has said is that students who fail an exam should have the opportunity to receive one-to-one feedback, help and support. But that in itself, I think, throws up some issues that I know Neil is going to talk about a little bit later. So what do you do? Well, looking broadly, there is some differences, as you might imagine. But there are two types of feedback that are generally delivered. One is the cohort feedback. And this is done in different ways, often through Learning Central, via email, via workshops. Quite commonly, people are provided with histograms that give mean marks, the marks per question, standard deviation, so that an individual can have some idea as to how they compare to the rest of the cohort. Not uncommon for there to be model answers, example scripts that are sometimes made available, or generic comments that often point out some of the common errors, some of the points that people got quite wrong, marks per question, specific question, etc. So there's a range of practices that are undertaken around that kind of cohort feedback. In terms of individual feedback, this is often more personal, or it seems to be. So this is often by personal tutors, by module leaders. I know some schools make available opportunities for students to come in, have a look at their scripts, have a look at the annotations upon them, but the take-up we know is not huge in that area. And some of it, again, is provided by pigeonholes. But this is an opportunity for students to review annotations, have a look at individual comments, again, the breakdown of marks, and often through personal tutors is much more around the generic review of an individual's strengths and weaknesses in terms of their performance across a range of exams. And it is normally offered to students who fail modules as per the university policy. I think there's a range of issues that do emerge from the way in which this is done. One, as I mentioned before, in terms of the advice, the guidance that we give to students in advance of exams, how much we tell them what they're going to get afterwards, how clear we are, how we manage those expectations. But perhaps more importantly than that, what worries me is the variation in practice in this area, both within an individual school, particularly between sections of an individual school and between schools. And certainly this has impact on any school that provides joint honours provision, where often you have a student who's doing two halves of a degree in different schools, and finding in one school they're getting detailed one-to-one written feedback, and in the other school they're just getting something on Learning Central if they're lucky. Because there is some variation between individuals as well. I know there are some people who do an awful lot of really good detailed work in this area, and I'm sure that some of you within this room fall into that category, but that is not anything that colleagues routinely are asked to provide. I think one of the biggest issues is around timing, and I'm not going to say very much about this because I'm sure this is going to emerge later. I'm sure Neil has one or two things to say about this. In that the university has said that feedback needs to be provided within 20 working days, or sometimes that can be before the end of the exam period. Is that before an exam board? Is that subsequent to an exam board? Is it done through personal tutors at the end of next session? There's a number of issues around this that I think we need to be clearer about and work out actually what is going to be best for our students. But in terms of the nature of the feedback that people are providing on exams, I do worry that some of this is just a justification of marks rather than an aid to future learning. It's why that student has got that particular mark rather than what it is they need to do in the future to help improve their performance. And how can students use it? We know that not many students are coming in to pick up exam feedback, but feedback is only valuable. And we know this from a lot of research that's done in this area, when there is an opportunity for dialogue that happens subsequent to it, that there is an opportunity for students to use that feedback to close the loop. And yes, a lot of students don't have the assessment literacy skills that is going to make a difference, that's going to encourage them to use it. But equally, some of the information that we're providing to them in this area, I'm not sure that there is always an opportunity for students to pick it up and use it and take it forward. So I think there's a range of issues that I hope whet the appetite in terms of some of the things that we want to talk about today. I'm going to come back to the data now, and this was one thing that I was asked to do. I didn't choose to do it, honest. I was asked to do in terms of the exam data that we collected from schools, and I was asked to compare that against NSS scores, and in particular around NSS scores for individual questions. And the one question that as a whole most schools do worse on across the university is NSS question 9. I have received detailed feedback on my work. And there is, as you can see from that graph, some correlation between the number of exams that are offered within individual schools and the NSS scores that are being achieved within those schools. Now you'll note I used the word correlation there because I want to make it very clear that I do not necessarily see correlation as causation. But you might argue that it is perhaps not reasonable for this relationship to exist, and conversely for there to be a more positive relationship between the proportion of coursework and those NSS scores, in that students often aren't actually just getting those comments, or if they're getting those comments, they're not something that is routinely provided to all, and it's not something that people see as being detailed comments as you might provide on a piece of coursework. And it's, I think as Neil alluded to it, it's the difference between coursework and exams is perhaps one of the things that has forever and a day existed within the university, and whether actually the differences in the way in which those different methods of assessment operate are something that we need to look at. In terms of PGT, similar correlations, not the same degree and not the same degree of significance in terms of the relationships between them. And bear in mind that I did, as I said before, the type of PGT programs that we offer across the university are very different in terms of student numbers, in terms of discipline, in terms of whether they're professional or otherwise. Also worth bearing in mind that just under 50% of eligible students complete the postgraduate taught experience survey. So in terms of the sample size, there is, I think, a further caveat that I would put on that data. Now the last thing Neil asked me to do was look at the future of exams. And, well, I'm not sure I'm much of a crystal ball merchant in terms of looking at the future. But so I just want to pose a couple of questions for you, which again I hope will encourage you to think about this as we go through this event. The first of which is, has pen and paper had its day? Now, there are a number of e-assessments that are being run in the university, some of which are being now run summatively. But I think there are a number of issues that we need to look at in terms of that. I think they can work well when the pedagogy is right, but the technology, how secure is it? How long-lasting is it? We've seen from the NHS over the weekend that the need to have further investment and make sure that things are secure is fairly important. So how robust are some of those technologies? Have we the space to run large-scale e-assessments? Some universities have got cavernous barns filled with computers in which students come in to take exams. But again, what kind of exams are they sitting? E-assessments currently work well, I think, for short problem solving, for short answer basis, for multiple choice, for single best answers. But if you think of the pedagogy, particularly in AHSS around writing essays, does that work? Is the software available that allows that kind of critical analysis to be, allows that kind of electronic marking to take place? But equally, as a student, how often will your students, when they go out in the world of work, be told to write with pen for a couple of hours at a time? They're probably not. They're probably going to sit in front of their computer like the rest of us and type away. The second question is, will the demand for exam feedback decline? So I think you can make quite a good argument that if assessment diets are well worked out, there's lots of formative opportunities, and that the formative feedback that's provided to students helps them learn and works well in terms of meeting the demands of their learning before they take that final summative assessment, that maybe actually they don't need a lot of feedback from exams. They finish the module there. There's clearly a lot of students who are very happy to file it away and move on to the next module when they have completed that exam. But we have heard around student expectations how much they're increasing, and we've seen certainly in the US, and I rather fear this is coming over to the UK, there is a culture now of grade grubbing, which I think is a horrible phrase. But I think we've seen it very clearly when you get people knocking on people's doors saying, can I have a few extra marks because I did that bit? Lots of checking of marks, rather than it being around feedback that feeds forward. But we are, I think, going to have to look, however this is done, around the processes, the systems, the ways in which we work if we're going to meet those expectations. And finally, can we have exams that better reflect the workplace? Because those students that become graduates, that then sit at those computers, they don't need to know all of the knowledge that we necessarily have taught them over the 3 years. Yes, the understanding is going to be great, some of the skills are going to be great, but if there's a particular thing they're going to look up, they're going to do exactly what we do, and they're going to go to Google and they're going to type it in. Rather than having exams as a memory test, should we be making more use of open book exams? There are some, very few examples of this now undertaken across the university, where people get a particular text that they are allowed to take into that exam, so that it's not around the memory, it's about what you do with that piece of information. But I think that there are a number of questions and issues that arise from that in terms of standards, marking criteria. It's not a memory test, so what is it the student is doing in the exam? They should be able to do a lot more if they have a memory test. Similarly, in 1 or 2 schools, they're having seen exams, and this is a way which is set out in these schools as a way of reducing anxiety that the students have. But equally, we're seeing 1 or 2 students who are then preparing an answer around that question in advance, and they get to the exam venue and they just sit there and they use their memory to write it down. So is that a good method of doing an exam? I'm just putting that out there as a question. That's it. Some questions I hope.